Hi, Eric.
Hello, how's it going, Jessica?
Good.
Hi,
Hello, Nasreen.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm very, very excited to hear this entire presentation today.
Thank you so much again for jumping in.
No problem at all.
What time is it for you? Like,
it's about to be 4 a.m.
Oh,
that's dedication right there.
Yeah. I just want to practice very quickly the screen sharing.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, is it Are you seeing it?
No, you still cannot see anything.
Let me. Okay, how's that?
That
Looks like it's loading now. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, that looks good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
nice.
Okay.
Perfect.
So the Q&A is where will we see questions there, or should we look in the chat for them? Do you know?
I believe that they should appear in the chat, but I was on the main stage for the other session that I was in, so I'm a little less certain about how this will play out. But I will also verbalize, and I can send you questions as well through the chat. Okay, it is time. It is the hour now, so I think that we can go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in this workshop on digital activism and data storytelling for organizing and mobilizing. Today, I am joined by two really great folks that are going to take us through this amazing workshop, Nasreen and Jessica from Visualizing Palestine. And Visualizing Palestine creates data-led visual tools to address a factual, rights-based narrative of the movement for Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality. VP is the first and largest project of Visualizing Impact, a nonprofit organization that since 2012 has specialized in visual communication for social justice. Nasreen is a graphic designer, illustrator, and researcher based in Amman, Jordan, and her work focuses on the intersection of graphic design and justice-oriented movement work. She joined the VP team in 2021. Jessica is the Deputy Director of Visualizing Palestine and has been part of the team since 2013. Over the years, she has had the opportunity to collaborate on many VP stories, and as a researcher, copywriter, and project manager, and she supports the day-to-day operations. So I am so excited to be here, to be able to help facilitate this amazing session. I am Eric Sipe. I am a US-based national organizer for Hamla, and I primarily work with our US-based partners, but really today my role is to get out of the way and let Jessica and Nasreen shine. So I will pass it over to both of you now.
Thank you so much, Eric, and hi, everyone who's here. Thank you so much for joining. I just realized on screen that my name also appears as Nasreen, so I don't know why that happened, but I'm Jessica, just so everyone's familiar. And if I come up in the chat as Nasreen, sorry about that. But yeah, so we are so excited to be a part of this session, and just want to thank Hamle for inviting us. I've had an opportunity personally to join a few of the sessions over the last couple of days, and have really enjoyed gathering in this space and hearing from so many people doing such good work for digital rights and for digital activism. It's just, we always love this space and are excited to be presenting this year. And Eric, also want to thank you for jumping in to facilitate this session with a last minute change of plan. So before we jump into the presentation today, we just wanted to get a little bit of feel for those of you who are joining us, and thank you so much for joining. So if you could open your chat, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and would love to see just a +1 in the chat if any of these apply to you. So place a plus or a yes or whatever, and some indication in the chat if you're somebody who works with data. So whether you're somebody that knows where to get data, where to look for it, how to analyze it, how to clean it, how to scrape it from the web, how to create charts. Seeing one reply. Yeah, seeing a couple thumbs up. Awesome. So a few people who are comfortable with data. So would love to see now, place a plus in the chat if you're somebody that considers yourself a storyteller in any medium. So that could be, film, photography, written, poetry, anything like that. Podcast, that's awesome. A couple of storytellers in the room. Wonderful. And then if you are a graphic designer or artist, do we have any graphic designers or artists with us? Not seeing anything so far. So maybe, okay, non-professional graphic design. That's great. That's awesome. And then how about human rights activists or advocates? Yep. Okay. Yes, seeing lots of that, which is not surprising at all. So I'm asking these questions because partly to get to know who's in the room with us, but partly also because we're talking about data storytelling today, and data storytelling is a multidisciplinary practice. It takes a lot of different skill sets to put these kinds of stories together. And you may be somebody that is a so-called jack of all trades, if that's an expression that goes beyond English, somebody with a lot of diverse skill sets. But most of the time, data storytelling happens through the collaboration of a lot of different people who each bring a different skill set. So today's session, we imagined it as just a space to converse with each other about the role of data storytelling as a practice within social movements, and in this case, obviously within the Palestinian movement. And we want to start by discussing a little bit, just grounding us in VP's approach to data storytelling, which is a concept-led approach. So we're going to present about that a little bit. And we'll offer a few tips and pointers from our experience for those who are interested in doing this themselves or integrating some of these practices into their own work. And then we'll walk through one example of a specific visual we produced and how it went from a concept to a final publication. And then we'll have time at the end for conversation with each other and with you. So please do use the chat throughout the session to drop your comments and your questions. And now I'll pass over to Nasreen.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jess. Yes, I'm Nasreen. even though we seem to be sharing the same profile name at the moment. But we just have a presentation here to help kind of walk you through some of VP's approaches to data storytelling for organization and mobilization. So to start, just gonna tell you a bit about Visualizing Palestine. We are an organization that focuses on data-led visual stories for social justice that advance a factual and liberatory narrative of Palestine and Palestinians. We're a small remote team, and most of our work is a collaborative effort. So I just want to shout out all of our other team members who aren't here today. And before I dive in, I also want to mention that VP's visuals are made possible by over 500 members who collectively fund our work. So I want to thank VP's members, without whom VP would not exist. And if you want to hear more about how you can possibly become a member, I'd be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. But to introduce you to VP, over the past decade, VP has produced over 100 visuals, which have been translated into more than 20 different languages. And the vision behind our work is to create tools that anyone can use to educate and communicate the messages of the movement for Palestinian liberation. In addition to visuals, VP is...
I'm not seeing the presentation at the moment. I don't know if others, could you indicate in the chat if others are seeing it? Okay, others are seeing it. So for some reason, it just seems that I'm not, which is a good thing, I guess.
Okay. But I'll try to slow it down, and hopefully that might help. So in addition to the visuals that we produce, VP has also worked to develop several interactive and educational platforms, including Palestine Open Maps, which digitizes and makes accessible archival maps of Palestine, Palestinian Journeys, which is a collaborative interactive platform in partnership with the Palestinian Museum, and Visualizing Palestine 101, which is our 101 series of a very kind of basic introduction to the history and context of Palestine, and a video series called So Close Yet So Far, which explores how Israeli restrictions prevent Palestinian families from meeting and keeps them separated. And what unites all of these efforts is a focus on popular political education about Palestine and creating resources, whether for activists, advocates, scholars, and anyone else who wants to learn and teach about Palestine. So just to kind of give you a window into what we've been up to recently, I want to walk you through some of our more recent visuals. So most recently, we released a visual on food sovereignty, exploring Israeli restrictions on Palestinians' food sovereignty and how they affect different ingredients of the Palestinian table, whether it be olives, milk, eggs, fish. And we also recently released a visual called Divide and Dominate, which explores how Israel's apartheid system affects and fragments all Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the diaspora, and prevents Palestinians from collectively exercising their right to self-determination. And just before that, we released a series called Academia Serving Apartheid that explores how Israeli academia upholds and benefits from colonial violence and from military research and development, and additionally perpetuates violence against Palestinian faculty, students, staff, etc. And then at the very beginning of the year, we released the first of our series exploring environmental justice topics in relationship to Palestine. So for instance, this series, which was a series of 5 visuals, looked at how climate change disproportionately impacts colonized people and Palestinian climate vulnerability, as well as how Israeli parks and nature reserves are used to erase evidence of the Palestinian Nakba, and how the occupation uses the West Bank as a dumping ground for hazardous and toxic wastes. And lastly, how the Israeli government and corporations pillage Palestinian resources for their own economic gain. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we've been up to recently. But of course, you can check out our website, which is where we upload all of these visuals, make them accessible. They're all Creative Commons and free to download, share, and use. And additionally, on Twitter and Instagram as well, we release visuals kind of in tandem with that. And so now I want to take a step back and talk a bit about the broader context for VP's work and why we practice data storytelling. So last May, during the 2021 Palestinian uprising, we witnessed Palestinian perspectives breaking more and more into mainstream discourse across social media and even in traditional news outlets. So, as Vox said, 2021 is the year Palestinians proved that they could compete with the Israeli government in the narrative battle. Now, this was happening despite mass censorship on digital media platforms and cyber assaults by trolls and bots. But of course, this is a digital rights conference, so I'm sure you've already heard enough about that. But just laying the groundwork here. And in addition, the shift is also taking place alongside increasing repression of Palestinian advocacy. So this is a map from Palestine Legal's new platform exploring legislation aimed at criminalizing BDS in the United States, although we see similar efforts elsewhere across the world. And of course, this is also happening in the context of the Israeli government directly targeting Palestinian civil society organizations with terrorist designations and increasing repression of their work. And yet, despite all of these efforts, Palestinian perspectives have become increasingly mainstreamed in news media, on digital platforms, and in global solidarity movements. And throughout the past few years, we've also seen how people have used VP's visuals to educate and inform new audiences about Israeli colonialism and also Palestinian resistance to it. And we've even seen organizations that previously avoided taking a stance on Israeli practices of apartheid now feeling themselves compelled to, release reports, make statements, finally call a spade, and declare, that Israel's apartheid system exists against Palestinians. And I wanted to point out that one of the maps that Amnesty International cites in this report, the one on the right-hand side, is actually, it cites back to VP. So we kind of see how these maps travel even beyond the visuals that we produce and are used and repurposed in different contexts. VP additionally partnered with Human Rights Watch to produce a visual series to summarize and complement their own apartheid report. And on that note, I want to hand it over to my colleague Jess to speak a bit more about kind of our approach to data storytelling in the context of reports and things like that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so if you could just bump one slide forward if you haven't already. I have a bit of lag on my side, so I'm not always sure what's on screen. But yeah, this is a fact that if you've seen us speak before, you've probably seen this fact before. It's from a 2013 report in which the World Bank looked at the rate at which its own reports were downloaded and cited and read. And so it's really just an entry point for thinking about and talking about the ways that we share and consume information about social issues, about human rights, and how this is also changing today, and how we can communicate in forms that make knowledge more accessible to more people, and meet people in the spaces where they're spending time. So that's why we came to data storytelling as an intervention, as a way of bringing this kind of information into social media, into a flexible form that can be used across a lot of different types of spaces. And we'll show you a few more examples of that momentarily. But I wanted to briefly share a quote from a data visualization practitioner, Moritz Stefaner, that I really like. And he says, "Data visualization can help us both to understand complex issues a bit better, but also to provide images to debate about, to refer back to, and sometimes just to meditate over. I want people to use the visualizations I provide as starting points for their own explorations." So, this session is really about thinking through what role data visualization, data storytelling, these kinds of practices can have in advocacy. And I think that this quote really resonates with how I think about it in terms of giving people a tool that they can refer back to, an archive of resources that they can look at, that provide entry points into issues, into bodies of research, into campaigns and movements. So that's what we're trying to do with our tools. And we've felt that data storytelling has a role to play for a few reasons. And one is that we are aware from what we've read of educational research that multimodal learning is considered important as a way to help people understand concepts and really internalize them and remember them. And so by providing a visual tool, we can provide one more tool that engages learners in a different way. And second, that Nas showed some examples of how the Palestinian narratives are proliferating on social media today, but we also know that the internet today, and especially social media, is not a very friendly space for long form content. And it's a space where we tend to get a few minutes, a few seconds maybe of people's time and attention. So we need a bridge between places that demand a lot of long periods of attention, human rights reports, books, investigative journalism, academic dissertations of the world. These things are still very relevant and very important, and too often they aren't read enough. And so we want to create a bridge between those important sites of knowledge creation and the spaces where people are spending a lot of time, spaces like social media, meetings with officials and elected officials and decision makers, protests, other spaces where you really have these sort of more fleeting connections with people, and you may only get a few moments of their time. And finally, I think that data storytelling is a really incredibly flexible medium, especially the infographics, the kind of static, where you can use it both online and offline. And so Nasreen is just going to flip through a few slides that show some of that flexibility. Here it's being used in a presentation at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Here, these are a few books that our work has appeared in. This is at the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit. This is an exhibition in Toronto. This is the American Anthropological Association conference where they had a BDS vote quite a few years back now. A film festival, a restaurant in Beirut, and a subway station in Washington, D.C. during the APAC event. So those are just a few examples of, the multiple ways that you can place work like this. And of course, that's in addition to some of the examples of sharing on social media that we showed a little bit earlier. So I'm going to hand back over to Nasreen.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about VP's approach to data storytelling. And I want to start by just explaining what that is. So we define data storytelling as the practice of building a narrative around a set of data and its accompanying visualizations to help convey the meaning of that data in a powerful and compelling fashion. So of course, there are many kind of building blocks that go into this. Of course, there's the data itself and the information, but that also includes the story concept, how we want to frame that data, the visual elements, how we're visually presenting that data, and then the goal, so what we want the visualization to achieve, specifically, like what information or what concept do we want people to walk away with knowledge of, and then the audience. So who is this aimed at? Is it aimed at advocates? Is it aimed at, activists who have a really deep knowledge and just need this, in their toolkit? Or is it aimed at, a more general audience that needs an introduction to a concept rather than a deep dive on it? So these are all the things that we take in mind when we're building up our data stories. And of course, there are many different types of visualizations. There's the exploratory visualization that, it starts with a data set and visualizes it and then kind of uses it as a jumping off point to explore what conclusions you can draw by looking at the visualization of the data and identifying trends or other, notable things within it, or starting with a concept, and this being the more explanatory type of visual. So starting with a concept and then looking at how can we best visualize and compile data to present this concept in a way that is accessible and intuitive to an audience who may not, be able to look at like the spreadsheet of the data and come away with, like a really clear idea of what it's representing to them. So a lot of our visuals tend to fall into that upper right category, the more explanatory side. But of course, when we start off with data visualizations, we have to first look at data. So, one of the first questions is, what is good data? And of course, we have to take all of these different aspects into mind. Does it come from a trusted source? Is it reliable? Is it accurate? Is it relevant? Is it complete? Is it timely? And most importantly, can it tell a story, or what story can it tell? And of course, there's always a collaborative aspect to this. So there's a strong role that relationships play in these knowledge ecosystems. And good data also comes from building strong working relationships with researchers, organizations, and organizers who can kind of collect that data and then put us in touch with it. And then when it comes to visualizing data, there's a number of applicable skills. Of course, the research side of it and data fluency, but also skills such as mapping, so familiarity with geographic information systems and spatial data, information design, so how to present data in a way that is competent and accurate and correctly reflects the data and uses the right charts for the right data. Visual communication, so understanding how people are responsive to different visual stimuli. Illustration, of course, bringing in the editorial element of framing the data through illustrations that convey some aspect of its meaning. Copywriting and editing, so how you frame it in words, the data itself. And then web development, if it's being presented on the web, which is, very key in the kind of social media information age. And so I'm just gonna walk you through a couple of different ways that VP has approached data storytelling in the past. So there are several different techniques that we use. Some include mapping, such as this visual, which basically visualizes the town of Hebron and looks at different areas of settlement growth. Or this map, which is one of our early visuals and also one of our most popular, I think, when it came out, which looks at the segregated road system in the West Bank. And then there's also more traditional forms of data visualization, such as this chart, which visualizes different divestment movements against South African apartheid, fossil fuels, and Israeli apartheid, and sort of putting them in alongside one another to show the sort of growth of these various divestment movements. And then this visualization, which uses a tree map data presentation to show the status of Palestinian villages that were depopulated during the Nakba, and showing how much of the land has not been built over, with the framing, of course, the editorial framing of return is possible. So focusing on right of return and using data to complement that narrative. We also use sequential art, so that's basically storytelling in almost comic book-like formats to tell, if there's a story that we want to tell with the facts that, isn't necessarily kind of like a one visual type thing, like maybe it needs kind of something that shows a sequence of events as they happen, cause and effect. So this one explores how Airbnb benefits from Israeli rights abuses, while this visual focuses on how European pension funds go to fund settlements. So things that might not necessarily be intuitive and laying them out in sequence to show how A leads to B, leads to C, etc. We also produce data statements. So these are visuals where we just have one really compelling fact that we want to share with an audience. And it normally uses a very simple visual graphic and a kind of bold fact to just, put out the data statement and really hammer home like a particular point, such as this one, which focuses on the 2014 bombardment of Gaza and looks at, basically numerically compares the amount of children, civilians, Palestinians, homes, public buildings destroyed, and contrasting that with the zero accountability for Israeli politicians and military generals who are responsible for the assault. So now, having gone through a couple of different design and data visualization styles, I want to hand it back to Jess for a couple of tips for developing concept-led data stories.
Yeah, I wanted to put together a few thoughts on, this session. It's short enough that we can't really do a training. We can't, these are all skills that are many hours go into learning how to work with data, how to, how to do design work, etc. So, but at the same time, I believe, as somebody that came from a background in international development, and that, I'm not an artist, I'm not a designer, but learned to become very comfortable with thinking conceptually about what makes for a good data story. And so I wanted to share a few tips that I've found helpful as somebody that's coming into this work from that background. And so if you can switch to the first tip. So my first tip is to write down ideas that you come across. And I think that having an idea or making a note to yourself that, oh, this could make a cool visual is something that's kind of like having a dream that if you don't write it down right then and there, then you're probably going to forget it, and you'll have this nagging sensation that like, I had a really good idea, but I can't remember what it was. So we have what's on the screen there on the right is a little spreadsheet where we've kept ideas, and this is an older one, so some of these we've already worked on by now, and some of them are a little outdated, but it's just to give you a sense of like, it can be any form, it doesn't have to be this, but we just used a spreadsheet where on the left we would put a few keywords about what the idea is, maybe a link to the story or the source that sort of initially triggered that idea, and then on the right a few lines of explanation of what we had in mind or how that idea came about. Maybe it's like, I was talking to this person and they mentioned this fact, and I thought, wow, that would be something really interesting to visualize. So I keep a lot of notes myself on even other topics that I'm interested in, that I always think this would make an amazing visual, and later then you can go back and you can start testing those ideas and seeing which ones are really worth working on. So that's another tip I have, is to not prejudge ideas at the time that you have them. Just write them down. Don't worry about whether they're good ideas, bad ideas, but even valid or relevant. But later when you decide what's a priority to work on, you can test those ideas against some criteria that you have, which if you can switch to the next slide, Naz. We have at VP some editorial criteria that we've developed that helps us determine what to work on. The problem that we usually face is not coming up with good ideas, but actually how to prioritize ideas, because there are so many important topics. We get a lot of requests from partners, and there's so much that's worth working on. And so how do you, with limited capacity, decide what to work on and try to make it as strategic as possible? So this article, I'll just drop a link to it in the chat, and so you can look a little deeper, but it explains how we decide what visuals to create. And some of the considerations that you'll read about in there is going back to what Nasreen was talking about the building blocks. You know, we're looking at, is there data on this topic? And if so, is it reliable data? You know, who would the audience for this topic be? Who are we hoping to reach? And is this a story that would resonate with them? Is this a topic? What's the longevity of the topic? Is it something that will be relevant and useful just today? Is it like reactionary and we'll forget about it next week? Or is it something that, you know, addresses kind of like a root of injustice, and maybe it would become a core tool that can be used over and over again over time? Also, we look at things like, is the topic new to VP? Because we have at this point developed so many visuals that we're trying to fill gaps in our collection of resources. And so if we've covered a topic before, maybe we wouldn't choose to cover it again, or maybe we do want to from a slightly different angle. So those are some of the things you can read about in our editorial criteria. And of course, every organization would probably have slightly different criteria of how they might choose what ideas to develop visually. And also, with coming up with ideas, these are some sources of inspiration, places that we tend to come across ideas. And so it comes from reading human rights reports and seeing, you know, the messaging and the information that's emphasized, from following academic articles, from reading media. I was just reading recently some coverage around the number of journalists that Israel has killed since various points in time, and immediately thought, you know, this could be a data story. So that's just an example of how, you know, current events and media coverage can lead to stories. But also another thing I noticed and tried to highlight here is how many different figures are being given from different sources around how many journalists have been killed. And so the question then becomes, okay, if we were to go into this, if we were to research it, could we find reliable information? Which of these sources is most reliable, most up to date, etc. And so, so this becomes kind of a concept of and behind it is a question: how many journalists has Israel killed since X date? So that's just a recent example, but all the time we're kind of coming across things like that from reading, from conversations with partners, from attending events like this, other sessions, etc. And then another tip I have is to follow people who are engaged in some practice that is relevant to data storytelling. I've put here a few accounts that I really enjoy following on Instagram, but there's many others, of course. And I think probably all of us on this call have, if we use social media, we have feeds that are full of organizations that we follow that we're interested in, information about Palestine or other issues that are important to us. But maybe if you're not a data visualizer or a data storyteller, maybe you don't have a lot of that kind of material coming up in your feed. And in that case, it can be really helpful to know what other people are doing and to expand sort of your understanding of what's possible in this field. So the first person here, Mona Shalabi, is somebody I really love her work. It's very unique, it's very distinctive. And she also has a very creative way of using the social media space, especially Instagram, like making visualizations that cross through many slides. For example, I'll just drop one in the chat that shows some of the creative stuff that she's doing on social media. But she also works off of, works with museums and journalism outlets, really, really interesting work. And a lot of it is hand-drawn too, which I think is really interesting. It kind of takes away from these like hyper-polished, digitized. I know that she works digitally as well, but it has this sort of hand-drawn feel, which is cool. And then Information is Beautiful is a studio that is not only do they have their own data visualization and data journalism work, but they also have Information is Beautiful awards every year. So it's a great place to go if you want to discover like other practitioners. They highlight a lot of cool work that's happening, that's notable, and that's kind of pushing the boundaries of this practice. And then Forensic Architecture is an example of a research, research organization and investigative organization that's doing really technical, really in-depth, interesting work that uses sometimes data visualization, but also a lot of other skills. And they've looked into a lot of topics on Palestine, including like the killing of Reza Najjar and of Ahmed Arakat. And so really, really interesting investigations. They have an amazing, very interesting platform on Pegasus. If you haven't seen that, I definitely encourage you to check it out. And then the last person here is somebody whose work I would consider more political art. And that's also a part of what we do. And so really, really love this artist's work. And one of his pieces was kind of a direct reference for one of our pieces from the environmental justice series. So some of that kind of, you get inspired with imagery that you can sort of, keep in mind as you're creating your own work. So that's number 2. And then 3, I think it's really helpful if you're not somebody that works heavily with data to start getting familiar with different types of charts and different ways of visually encoding information. And a resource I wanted to share on this is the Data Visualization Catalog. There's a link to it at the top of that slide, but I'll also paste it in the chat. And this is a very simple website that just lists out a bunch of different types of charts, shows examples of actual data being plugged into those charts, allows you to search by the function of those charts. So is this helpful for comparisons, or is it helpful for showing relationships, or when would you use this chart? So I think that can be really helpful, because sometimes for people who don't do a lot of data visualization, you don't even know, okay, what charts are, like, how can I think about visualizing this? What forms are available to me? And when are they relevant? So I think that's been something that has helped me get comfortable with what's out there. And then Raw Graphs is an application that is open source, accessible, anybody can use it, and it's a place that you can go to start playing around with creating your own data visualization. So if you are interested in that, this is a pretty accessible tool. There's multiple tools out there that do similar things, but this is one that you can upload a data set and you can kind of plug it into a number of different charts. And there's tutorials on that platform to show you how to use it. So I think it's a really helpful one to check out if you're, also there's something as simple as just working in Excel or in Google spreadsheets. You can create pivot tables, you can create really simple charts. And nowadays, Google Sheets will even suggest to you this, if you highlight a set of data, oh, this chart might be relevant. So there's some ways that you can start playing around and experimenting and learning what works and doesn't. And I think at the end of the day, that's kind of how you get comfortable, is just by playing around with data that interests you and seeing what you can find. Next slide. All right, so my fourth tip is to just sketch things by hand. I think sometimes there can be a barrier that if you're not a designer, then you can't contribute to the visualization of information. You can't make, you're just not like the person that can present ideas around how to lay out information visually. But a lot of several of these sketches are from designers. So you'll see like Gaza's Economic Collapse. It looks very lovely and beautiful and very similar to what the final visual looked like. But there's other ones that like behind that are two that I did that are just like, me putting my pen to paper, not an artist, not a designer, but just trying to capture an idea that I have in mind. And so this is really helpful for brainstorming. We also encourage all of our partners, like, just put your, start sketching, because if you can get something that you have in your mind out on paper, it's really, really helpful, especially when collaborating with designers, to sort of have that back and forth where they can see what you have in mind and you can kind of have an exchange. So definitely very, very helpful. And then finally, creating a brief is a practice that we use very frequently at VI. Almost every single project, every single visual that we create starts with a brief. And this is, I think, especially important when you do have a collaboration, when you have different people taking different parts of a project. The brief becomes this like central reference point where you can work back and forth and you can structure information and you can put together what those building blocks of a visual, thinking about what data is available, the audience, what the purpose of the visual is, what some inspirations are that might come into play. So the brief is really like our kind of anchor when we do these types of projects. And we are going to go through a more detailed example. So I'm going to just drop in the chat a copy of our brief template that is open source. So it's something that you're welcome to use in your own work. And sorry, I just switched screens as I was sharing that. So getting back to that. So now I think we want to do a walk. Go ahead.
Would you like me to open up the brief template in the share screen?
I don't think we need to, because we'll go through it when we do the Fort Worth Old walkthrough.
True. Okay.
All right. So can you move to the next section, please? Awesome. So we wanted to do a walkthrough of one visual to kind of show you what this brief tool looks like and also how we go from concept to final publication. And we selected this. This is a visual that we released around this time last year, as obviously we all know what was going on both in Jerusalem and in Gaza and across, there were multiple sort of ethnic cleansing events happening at that time, in addition to the bombardment on Gaza. And so we wanted to respond in some way to that, and this is what we came up with. And just because we're now at the 1 year mark, we thought we would revisit this visual again. And it really, the idea for it kind of started with following some of the news at the time that was going on. We saw this front page New York Times article that, published the pictures of all the children that had been killed. And it was something that was really widely shared by a lot of Palestinians at the time, because it was notable that the New York Times was acknowledging these deaths at all. But at the same time, we felt like it's such a narrow way of looking at what's happening just by children killed when it doesn't capture the situation, the sort of context that these children lived their lives in, and that hundreds of thousands of other children are still continuing to live their lives in. So we wanted to sort of go beyond that, sort of just looking at after the fact, counting numbers of bodies and things like that. And so also we saw this article that where Rifat El-Arir, who's a writer from Gaza, said that his daughter Lina is 8 years old, or in Gazan time, 2 wars old. And so that's kind of where that became the inspiration for the title, and immediately was like, that's something we can visualize. We can show what it means to have these sorts of milestones of violence in a child's life. This is Jihad Abu Salim, who spoke about his sister living through, she was 8 during this war, she was 12 during this one, 14, etc. So again, similar kind of idea, and we thought this is something really tangible to visualize. Next slide. And again, this is also an article by Jihad Abu Salim where he elaborates on how, for children in Gaza, or for anyone in Gaza, it's not just about these sort of incidents of what he calls spectacular violence. It's actually also about the everyday violence and the slower destruction that often remains invisible. So that kind of became a theme that we wanted to show, was the conditions of life in Gaza that shape, childhood for a child today. As we approach 15 years of the blockade, children who are 15 have never known life outside the blockade. So that brings us to the childhood in Gaza brief. And that one, it would be great if you could open up. So 1 second, I'm going to link it. Oh, you have it. Perfect. All right. So I just want to share what this brief looked like before we started working on it visually. So we had the idea in mind. We had a pretty clear concept that we wanted to show the childhood and child life milestones through the lens of what the situation is in Gaza. So that was this sort of like 4 wars old was a pretty clear concept, looking at child trauma, looking at the situation in Gaza through the lens of a young child's experience. So that became the theme of the visual. And usually we try to keep the theme pretty short, like 1 sentence that just says the topic of what this visual is about. And then our purpose was, in this case, to respond to what was going on, to add another angle. And we thought of the audience in terms of primarily, in this case, a general sort of mainstream public, that we would love for this visual to reach people who had seen that front page New York Times story and were aware, that there have been 63, or I'm not sure the exact number, but that there had been this many children killed, but may not be aware of the full context of childhood in Gaza and the sort of underlying structures of oppression that shape the lives of children long before they make the front page of the New York Times in this way. And we also wanted, social media mobilizers to be able to use this, influencers and young people who were at the time sharing counter narratives around what was going on, who were making sure that Palestinian perspectives were seen and understood. What Vox described as the year that the movement proved it could compete, which I think is funny. And then also for humanitarian and human rights organizations that are working in Gaza as well, that this could be a resource to continue sharing kind of those fundamental conditions of violence. And then the next section of the brief is key messages. So up front, we try to say, what is it that we want people to take away from a visual when they look at it? What are our key messages? And by defining those, we can then go back at the end of the project and test the final visual against those messages and say, did we actually meet our objectives messaging-wise here? Is there something that's missing, etc.? So here we wanted to emphasize that the population of Gaza is extremely young. It's one of the youngest populations demographic as far as community demographics in the world. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize when we're talking about 2 million people in Gaza. They're not thinking that half of these people are children. And so we really wanted to capture just how young this population is, and that these people are growing up under such extreme conditions of oppression and violence. And we wanted to prompt people to think about the children who survived the last Gaza assault and all of the previous ones before that, and what they may be experiencing, and how that they have never known life outside of the blockade. And then finally, we also wanted to sort of introduce or problematize like the different types of trauma that we always hear about Gaza when some sort of acute, super distressing event is happening, and then we don't hear about it again until the next bombardment. But what we wanted to talk about chronic trauma, about these prolonged forms of poverty, institutionalized discrimination, food insecurity, mental health issues, etc. So, and we also wanted to bring in this angle of historical or generational trauma, that around 70% of people that live in Gaza are either refugees or the children of refugees. And so there's trauma that, is passed down from generation to generation, and there's research in the psychological field around that idea of how trauma shapes future generations. And then in the 5th section of the brief, we started fleshing out ideas. Here we had we came in with a very clear idea of what the title was going to be. But in a lot of cases, we don't know right away what we want to title the visual. And so we kind of brainstorm here titles that we feel would sort of encapsulate the story, or that are catchy and interesting. And so a lot of times in this section of the brief, we'll have like 5 or 6 different possible title ideas that we brainstorm around. And then we'll have a few sentences that we can use as an introduction to the visual. And actually what's here now is not what ended up being the final introduction, I don't think. And that's because, this is copy that we start to work with that gives us something to start plugging into the visual, but then we continue to refine it as we see how it all comes together and we understand what's working and what's not working. So it gives you a starting point. And then section 6 is the most important part of the brief, the part where you start to plug in the data that you're actually going to be working with, or the information that you're actually going to be working with, and you start structuring it and giving it a hierarchy. So having an information hierarchy is really, really important for visual work. You never want to just dump into a brief all the information that you have on a topic, because you can go in 100 different story directions. And so you want to really start plugging in just the information that's pertinent to the topic that you're going to be using in the brief. And you want to start to define what's the most important piece of information for people to see, and then what are a few supporting facts, and also to think about what's actually too much for a visual, and what do we need to remove, or what do we need to clarify in a way that doesn't become too overwhelming for the scope of what one visual can achieve. And so here we had this table was like the core of the data and information for the brief, where we had dates and we had the milestone in that child's life. We defined a type of trauma that we were looking at, and then we put a fact with that. And so this is something that we ended up plotting out. You'll see how we approached it visually. You've seen the visual. It's kind of a growth chart of a child's life and these different events that they've lived through. And we're bringing together both things like the various attacks on Gaza, but also things like the fact that 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees, or the fact that there's deep poverty and right to education is an issue, schools are closed, power outages, etc. So we started to integrate all this information together. And then for this brief, we didn't have a lot of, we did have sketches that Nas will show you shortly, but we didn't draw on a ton of different, we didn't do a lot of creating art boards and mood boards, because it was a project that came together quite quite quickly. So that is what the brief looked like. I'm going to hand it back to Nasreen to talk a little bit about how it was developed visually.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to switch back over to the presentation. Okay. Is that showing up all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So brief to visual. So yeah, just kind of laid out the main themes and purpose and audience of the brief. And now I'm going to walk you through how we went about developing it visually. So of course, as just mentioned, we understood what our major themes were: childhood growth and development, different forms of trauma, and the cumulative effects of that trauma. So these were the three main things that we kind of wanted to pull together into the visual. And one of the early inspirations that we had were these kind of baby development growth charts. So showing kind of stage by stage how infants develop. And we were thinking about a kind of way of subverting that growth chart and taking something that normally is very kind of innocuous, very innocent. It's kind of, it's like a cute way of showing how children develop, and then placing it within the context of this dissonance of reading, authors from Gaza talking about how their children are 4 years old instead of, 4 years old or 8 years old. So this was the initial sketch developed by one of our designers, Yusra, which basically put the sort of developmental chart against the different forms of trauma that we were plotting. And then we were experimenting at this early stage with different ways to plot the elements of chronic and intergenerational trauma, ones that don't exactly, apply themselves like super intuitively to a timeline. So this is one of our later sketches. This is when we started to develop the idea, as you can see on the right-hand side, of color coding the different types of trauma, which would come in later as we develop the visual. And yes, so starting, very with this concept of, 4 years old, and then contrasting it with the actual age of the child. So maintaining that element of like, this is kind of like a rhetorical way of understanding childhood development in Gaza, but at the same time, a child is a child, like they're still just 13 years old, regardless of what they're experiencing. And so this is the wireframe. So this is the very kind of rough and dirty, like first try at bringing something from the sketch stage into the digital. Oftentimes this is done in black and white. It's very rough. It's just where we kind of begin to start exploring how we want to lay the information out visually and if it's working. And so you can see the illustration elements were very unrefined. There's like this kind of very creepy like baby that eventually got a better illustration later as the visual developed. And we were experimenting with putting the chronic trauma sort of below the birth chart and then plotting intergenerational trauma and acute trauma on the chart itself. And then as we progressed in the drafting and refinement stage, we began to lock down the colors. We began to look at, different ways of laying out the data. And then we came to this concept of visualizing the accumulation of different forms of trauma as this thread that is kind of connecting the different stages of childhood development. And as the child grows up, there are these different accumulations of different threads, whether it's intergenerational trauma or chronic trauma or acute trauma, how we wanted to visualize that as something that is accumulating. And at this point, we also brought in this quote from the chair of the mental health unit of the Palestinian Ministry of Health of, in Gaza, there is no post-traumatic because the trauma is repetitive and ongoing and continuous. So that's something that we also wanted to reference in the visual, showing this not as discrete events that happen and then they're done, but as the accumulation of different types of trauma that then inform childhood development and growth. And so this is where the visual ended up. As you can see, we ended up putting the elements of chronic trauma on the left-hand side as sort of a bar framing the entire experience of childhood, so lifelong conditions. And then you see in the successive years, the different experiences of being, born a refugee in 2007, immediately experiencing the Israeli blockade of Gaza, and then from there experiencing the first war, the second war, the third war, the Great Return March, which because of its longevity, we ended up deciding to categorize as a form of chronic trauma. And then the most recent fourth war in May of 2021. And one thing I wanted to highlight that I don't think we mentioned when we were discussing the brief was that the phrasing of these elements were also phrased in the first person. So this idea of rhetorically understanding, you know, when I was born a refugee. When I was born, Israel imposed its blockade on the Gaza Strip. I was 2 years old when I experienced my first bombardment of Gaza. And in this way, framing it as it is experienced from the perspective of a child. And I think that was important to how we wanted to approach the project, like Jess said, of not just understanding that it's not just about, you know, a tally of casualties, and that it's actually about understanding how it affects all Palestinians, you know, and also the fact that children grow into adults, and that it's not just about the innocence, you know, placed on childhood, but understanding that this is something that people experience as children and then bring into their adult lives, and that matters as well. So these were all the things that we tried to bring together in this visual, and of course it came together very quickly. I think we started it in May and released it around mid-June. So even on that very tight timeline, I think we were able to pack in a lot of different elements to sort of bring, I don't know, to bring this visual to fruition. And yeah, so I'll end it there. That was sort of the walkthrough from brief to visual. And I think now we'll transition into the kind of moderated conversation section.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nasreen and Jessica. That was really truly amazing, and I'm not surprised at how beautiful your slides were, based on how beautiful all of the projects that VP puts out are. But we have about half an hour left in this session, so we have a moderated conversation that we have kind of planned out here. But with the time left, if folks want to follow up on anything that I ask, either Jessica or Nasreen, in the chat, you can go ahead and do that, and we can integrate that into the conversation as we're going. And as I get towards the end of the questions that I have planned, I will open it up for Q&A as well. So please be thinking about anything that you would like to ask either Nasreen or Jessica as we go. But with that in mind, let's jump into this. I'd like to start the conversation at a pretty high level idea, and that is just how do you envision, how do you describe the role of data visualization in the movement? And I'll let you all decide who would like to answer that first.
Jess, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, sure.
I feel like you have the longer term vision.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, you know, here we've framed it as data visualization, the role of data visualization. But first of all, we see data visualization as one of quite a few practices that sort of merge data and story together. And so we sort of think of our work as a little bit broader: data storytelling. Sometimes we're bringing in data visualization. Sometimes we're bringing in, like Nasreen explained, sequential art, or we're taking a more illustrative approach, or we're just sort of highlighting one discrete piece of information. So multiple sorts of ways of approaching data in this. But I think that as far as its role in the movement, it goes back to my thoughts on the quote from Moritz Stefaner, that it provides something that you can refer back to, that you can meditate over, and as a starting point. So I always think of our work as it's an entry point. And so it's an entry point into an issue, or it's an entry point into a particular story or experience that Palestinians have, or it's an entry point into a really interesting body of research, maybe a very compelling report or a very sort of transformative body of knowledge. And so I think that, you know, that's how I see that by creating these tools, we're providing people with a number of different entry points into our movement and into the knowledge that's emerging from our movement. Because I think that key role that social movements play is in public education and in providing education that's usually missing from traditional spaces, from classrooms and even from universities a lot of the time, that it's in social movements that you start to piece together some of the root causes of what people are experiencing and the interconnections between movements and this sort of transformative body of knowledge. And so political education is a really important part of what we're doing. And so my final thought on that is just that, like, these visuals are not an end unto themselves. We're not just producing visuals because we can, or because they're beautiful, or because it's fun, interesting work. We're producing them because they're intended as a tool, and they're intended to be in the hands of somebody that's telling the story, that's using this for education or for learning. And so we always try to understand how our tools are being used and how they're activated within the movement, because at the end of the day, that's what's important is, is this a resource that is serving the movement? And is it effective in what we hope it's doing, which is providing this bridge between these sort of deep knowledge spaces and these sort of ephemeral social media, brief conversations that you have with your colleagues, or other ways that we communicate.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think also from the sort of visualization perspective, I think part of what VP is trying to do is also build a holistic visual language for communicating Palestine, because I think a lot of discussions are around how Palestine is spoken about rhetorically, and this whole idea of, permission to narrate. Do Palestinians have, how can we claim the right to narrate our own historical narrative? But I think there's an element to that goes beyond rhetoric in terms of actually visualizing liberation and visualizing also the structures of colonialism and apartheid. So I think it's one thing to understand intellectually and read about something like a segregated road system. I think it's another thing entirely to see it visualized in this very stark way. And I think it can almost radicalize different people in ways that, words or conversations, might not be able to get them quite to that point. So I think that element of visual language is also very important to the work. But of course, it's always within this context of the broader movement, and in the context of, the efforts made to push the rhetoric, push media, push advocacy, push the struggle. So it's just kind of one part of that network, but I also think it's an important one as well.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that really resonates with me. And the next thing I'm wondering, when you're talking about building this language, I'm wondering how data storytelling is relevant for building digital activism overall, and more generally speaking.
Yeah.
Do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I'll just I'll say kind of briefly to frame it up. I think this is actually something that we've been thinking about and discussing a lot, because when VP was first founded, infographics and data visualizations weren't quite as kind of instantly recognizable and immediately used as they are today. And I think now in particular, there's so many open source, softwares that allow people to engage with data and visualization, that the groundwork has really changed from when visualizing Palestine, visualizing impact was first starting off. There's a lot more data literacy in that regard, but also the ways that people engage with data visualizations has also changed. So if you look back at the VP archive, you'll see there's a lot of very dense, very long, weird proportion visuals that have a tremendous amount of information, but it's the kind of thing that you want to see up on the wall or printed out as a poster, something you can really spend a lot of time with. And I think there's still a lot of space for those kinds of visuals, because of course, we want these to be tools that are used digitally, but also in physical space. But with the sort of rise of social media and infographics and people sharing information over, Instagram, it brings up a lot of questions about the kinds of formats we use and why we use them, and how to adapt or format, the visual language, to suit that kind of space of digital advocacy without compromising on the sort of in-depth and beyond surface level content. But I don't know, Jess, if you wanted to speak a bit more to that.
Yeah, I think that digital activism, normally means we're meeting people in the spaces where they're spending time. And so social media is a big part of this. There's a lot of online tools that are available to us, petitions and things like that. There's a lot that goes into digital activism beyond social media, but that plays a big role. And we know that people are spending a lot of time on social media, that's where people's eyeballs are at the moment. And also that it's becoming one of the bigger ways that people are getting information. It's becoming a way that people are engaging with social movements. It's also a space that we share with other social movements. So it's a space that we can go and sort of connect with other movements that are sharing information. We can cross share, we can show, kind of solidarity between different movements. So social media plays a big role. And I think with data storytelling, you're kind of trying to do the most that you can in the limited space that is available. It's like, it's a way of grappling with this tension between like the fact that these issues are so much bigger than a post on social media. There's so much deeper. They deserve so much more of people's time. And yet this is where we find people, and this is where we start to get people to think about the ideas that we're trying to put into society. And so with VP, like a lot of times we're just grappling over like, how do you provide, like I said, an entry point to an issue in a space that people are going to be, are likely to see it, but not oversimplify it and not make it kind of this like throwaway that we're just trying to fill our timeline with the infinite scroll of like posts, So it's kind of, there's always a tension in that. And I think that, I love the practice of data storytelling because I do think it allows you to do a lot with a little bit of space. And it also really forces you to kind of hone in on like, what's the message? What's the most important thing that we want people to understand? And how can we merge the different ways of talking about issues, that we can talk about issues in a very logical, sort of rational, data-led way, but at the end of the day, this is affecting the lives of real people. These are very life and death, emotional, human issues as well. And so by looking at both data and story, you're trying to like honor both of those ways of talking about issues. So just some reflections on some of the tensions of working in these kinds of spaces.
Totally, yeah, I love that, and I love that you all have allowed us to kind of reflect on what is possible. But now that we've thought about what is possible, I think it's also important to take a step back and be a little bit more critical to ensure that we're being intentional in this space, right? So I'm wondering about this common assumption that when you're working with data, you are working with objective truth. Is data objective, and how do you think about the politics that data data representation, rather?
Yeah, I think this is a really critical question, because I think, as you mentioned, there's often this there's this assumption that if you're working with like the hard facts, if you're working with data, then people will be swayed by that mere exposure to real facts. But I think, of course, we have to complicate that on several levels. Of course, there's the question of how is that data collected? What's the methodology that was used? Is that a sound methodology, or does that expose its own biases in terms of what it's choosing to evaluate? It's taking something that's qualitative, that's out in the real world, and turning it into something quantitative, into some, a number that you can put into an Excel sheet. So there's always some method of interpretation that's happening there, and it behooves us to think very critically about that process of collecting the data itself. But even when you're kind of sure of your sources, you think it's trustworthy and reliable, etc., there's also this reckoning with the fact of living in sort of post-truth disinformation age where there's this, widespread use of misinformation, of faulty science, of bad science, and of, this idea that people will choose the facts that suit the narratives that they're already inclined to believe. And then, of course, in the Palestinian context, you also have this, massive machinery of Hezbollah efforts that are basically, kind of constantly muddying the waters in terms of people coming to a clear understanding of what's happening in Palestine. So I think because of that, it's really important, I think, as Jess and I have mentioned before, to think of the facts, the data, and then the visualization of that as simply tools in a larger arsenal, in a larger holistic tool set for engaging interest and telling a story and conveying trust. Like, we hope that our visuals are convincing the open-minded of something, or provoking doubt or cognitive dissonance in more hardened minds. But we know that it's always a tool that's existing in the hands of, someone who's involved in a broader movement. So I think we have to, go beyond this idea that data visualization can be neutral, that it can speak in a language of utmost authority and be non-political, and really think critically about the fact that, okay, if there's no freedom from bias, whether in data visualization or journalism or whatever, how can we orient our practice towards justice and towards the marginalized and dispossessed in order to uplift their stories?
So well said, Nasreen. I wanted to just add to that a couple of examples that I've come across of how, just how data can be used in a way that, kind of manipulates understandings of topics as well. And last year around this time, one of the things that I saw going around social media was a chart that was basically trying to debunk the idea that Palestinians had experienced ethnic cleansing. And the chart that they were using to do this was one that just a very simple timeline that showed the growth of the Palestinian population over time. And the argument they were making with data was, if the Palestinian population is growing steadily over time, then how can there be ethnic cleansing? And so this is just one example of, like, to us, it's an absurd kind of representation of an issue that's twisting. Ethnic cleansing is not just about reducing population. It's not just about killing. It's about restructuring spatially a population. It's about removing them from certain areas. So, this chart didn't show, for example, that within this piece of land, the population declined by 80%. And, what would the population in this piece of land be if there hadn't been the Nakba? And so anyways, that's just an example of how, we do have to think critically about presentations of data, and they can be used to sort of advance multiple different narratives. And so, we're aware that we're not the only ones visualizing information, and that people are, like, especially on social media, there's all kinds of things going around that are unsourced, that are, sort of trying to present a different narrative than what we're trying to present. And that's a reality we're working with as well. And then another just recent example I came across as an example of, like, being why it's important to be critical of data and information is just a piece of information from our food sovereignty research around how much land was cultivated after the Nakba. So Israel claims that in the first few years, it brought 2 million dunams of land into cultivation that weren't previously cultivated, but they start counting in 1948. So they counted all of the land that refugees fled as uncultivated. And then they started taking over that land, establishing agricultural settlements on that land, and they counted it as being brought into cultivation, even though it was previously cultivated. So things like that, you can sort of see that where you start counting something can make a difference in how you paint the overall picture.
Thank you for that. That's super helpful to make sure that we're always, taking a critical approach to ensure that our work is as effective as possible. I want to, for a second, shift over to the Q&A from the audience, because there's a really interesting question here around translation and language that I think I would love for to hear a little bit from both of you on. And then there's a follow-up question. So I'll just read what is here and then let you all reply. But it says, could you brief us on the translation process of your visuals? How do you choose the visuals to translate? I noticed that many of your visuals are only available in English. How do you recruit translators? Do you modify the visuals themselves when they are translated, the visual part rather than the linguistics? And then there's a follow-up that is asking, how do you ensure that the visuals published in multiple languages are culturally appropriate for each audience? So there's a lot of really great stuff there. Thank you very much for the questions, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, thanks, Bushra, for that question. A really good one. I can start, and I'll just mention that. So VP commits to producing material in English and Arabic. So that's kind of our baseline commitment. The vast majority of our work is available in English and Arabic. So you should be able to find that on our website, but happy to point out how you can access the visuals in Arabic as well. All of the other 18 languages that the visuals have been translated into are volunteer translations where people approach us and they say, we want this visual in Spanish or in, whatever language they want. So that's, as such a small team, we would not be able to undertake trying to, drive the translation of this content into 20 languages, let alone customize it for every kind of cultural context. But what we do is, when people approach us and they say, we want this for our campaign in Brazil, but we need it in Portuguese, then we work with them. We give them a translation template that has the existing text. They fill in the target language text, and we usually have a disclaimer noting that this wasn't translated by VP, and then we implement it into the design, and that becomes a tool that they can use. So that's kind of how we deal with different languages. And for sure, I think the topic of how you might approach stories differently and approach visualizing information differently from different cultural contexts is very interesting, and something that we would love to go into more if we had more capacity and also more knowledge of what would resonate in different contexts. And sometimes we've had partners approach us saying we want to create a story for example, like for an audience in Singapore. And those are really interesting possible partnerships because we can come together with an organization who understands what might resonate in that context and work with them. So hopefully that answers some of your question about how we approach this.
Great, thank you so much for that. I now want to shift back to thinking specifically around social media, which I think is oftentimes one of the first places that we think of when we're thinking about data visualization for movement building and digital activism. But as you've mentioned, there are limitations there, and it's certainly not the only place that we should be thinking about using data visualization in the movement. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, what are the limitations and opportunities for building the Palestinian narrative on social media?
Well, I think maybe just to start, I think a lot of it has to do with that tension that Jess mentioned of the limitations of the platform and the formats that you're able to use, and then the amount of information that you want to convey. And I think, of course, that can be a productive tension, in that it drives you to hone in on what's really the important message that you're trying to get across. But it's also difficult in the sense that we don't want to sacrifice the message or the kind of deep thinking and engagement with the data to the platform itself. So I think it's always a bit of a negotiation. There's always, concessions being made, to either, to preserve the integrity, I think, of the project more generally. But I think in that way, while, struggling through those contradictions, it still is contributing to building a, I don't know, shareable Palestinian narrative for the social media environment. And Jess, I don't know if there was anything that you thought about that as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that the time that VP started was an interesting time in the history of social movements on the internet. So our work came together around 2011. The team first gathered, and 2012 is when we published our first visual. So that was, you know, revolutions were unfolding across the MENA region, and a lot of those revolutions were included. They were coined the so-called Facebook revolution and so on, because of the way that communities were organizing online. And since then, I think there was like a very optimistic sort of narrative at the time that we've moved into a new era where like now we have the tools to organize, and we can move beyond these sort of gatekeepers of information. And of course, we know that like we may have been ahead of the curve, movements may have been ahead of the curve in activating social media as a tool, but governments and our oppressors came into those tools very quickly and have also used them against us. And so, you know, it's a much more complicated dynamic. And yet at the same time, I think that original optimism around the potential of social media is still there in a way, in the sense that like, it's true that we can move beyond certain gatekeepers in these spaces, not all gatekeepers, but certain gatekeepers. And we can reach people directly. We can build a connection with audiences directly. We can interact with other movements. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there. And I think especially for Palestinians, because of the way that the Palestinian community has been so deeply fragmented in their homeland, and then of course spread across dozens of other countries in the diaspora, in a way, like we started tapping into online space as a movement because it was the only space that we could all gather. It became sort of like a Palestine online sort of thing, which is a term I saw in a paper by Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins. But this sort of like VP, for example, as an organization, we were working remotely, working digitally, collaborating through online tools long before the pandemic sort of forced everyone into that model. So, and that was because we were dealing with borders that made it hard for our team to get together in one physical space. So that's something that, you know, it's not unique to Palestinians, but it's something that I do think like makes us very connected to digital tools, that these are the ways that we can gather and mobilize. And so those are some thoughts on like the potential, but I think that we always have to remember that we don't own these platforms and that they are corporate spaces. They're not like liberation spaces in and of themselves, and that they could change or disappear tomorrow, that they can be bought by Elon Musk, or they can, you know, a programmer somewhere can change something in the algorithm and it can become much harder to reach people, or there can be outright censorship that we've already seen on many of these platforms. So I think that, you know, this is not something that VP does perfectly, but it's something we always try to think about, is how do we not become too wed to social media, that we actually have like our own space, and we try and also drive our community to connect with us in other ways that we do somewhat manage more independently. But of course we don't own the infrastructure of the internet, so it's like that always comes into question. But can we have people subscribe to our newsletter or go and find our content on our website? And can we produce content that's not just for social media, but that can kind of cross over between different types of spaces? And of course, there's always the looming issue of surveillance and, you know, government and oppressor presence in these spaces as well, that I think other people in this workshop in the Hamle space have addressed more over the past few days.
Thank you for that. That's a really helpful answer there. There's one question in the Q&A that, but we only have 4 minutes, so I want to be cognizant of time, and maybe we can try to have a quick response to this, which is, do you have any recommendations in sourcing reliable data specifically around Palestine?
Yes, well, first I want to echo what I think someone responded to that question, which is that on each of our visuals, we have an open source or an open access spreadsheet with all of the data that we use in a particular visual. So if you're interested in doing a deeper dive on any of the visuals that catch your interest, you'll find a lot of the material there. And then in terms of where we, sourcing reliable data, a lot of it has to do with collaborations with partnerships with, research organizations or Palestinian civil society groups, NGOs who work on compiling this data. And that often provides a strong basis for what we work with in the visuals.
Yeah, and you can see in those citation links as well some of the visuals or some of the sources that we often use. So I think they kind of fall into three main categories. One is like reports from human rights organizations, especially Palestinian human rights organizations. Another is reports from international organizations like the World Health Organization or other sort of, or OCHA, for example, that they do a lot of mapping and a lot of collection on, for example, settler violence and destruction of structures. And then a third one is kind of like government sources, which of course you always have to regard with sort of a skeptical and critical mind, but there are like both the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics and the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics collect population data and other kinds of data. So those are some of the sources. There's a ton of information on Palestine, and it can be really hard because it's fragmented. Like you'll find data that's just about the West Bank and food insecurity in the West Bank, and then you'll find it just about Gaza. And how do you talk about Palestine as a whole then? And you have to sort of piece together bits and pieces of information to try and talk about the Palestinian experience in a way that doesn't reproduce that fragmentation, which is one of the big challenges we face with the data that's available.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that helpful information for folks that are listening there. So it looks like we only have about a minute and a half left. So I would love to hear in this last wrap up how folks can support the work that you are doing. If you can give the audience some ways that they can support.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, everybody, for being here and for listening and for your thoughtful questions as well. I think I would just, if you want to connect with us going forward, I think the first step I would suggest is subscribing to our newsletter, because we are trying to keep that as a space where we can connect with people who are interested in our work directly, even before following us on social media. So that's what I would suggest, and I'll drop that in the chat for anybody who would like to subscribe.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much. It looks like we are at half an hour past, so it has been an absolute pleasure to listen to both of you, Nesreen and Jessica, and I'm a huge fan of Visualizing Palestine's work and so happy that you all are doing the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Eric, for hosting.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Sad that it's wrapping up so soon. Bye.
Bye.